Do you remember those African-American Christmas dishes no one makes anymore? Back then, they filled homes with the smell of spice, sugar, and Sunday music, a taste of love that held families together. When did those flavors of home start fading from our tables? Sweet potato pone was the kind of dessert that lived somewhere between cake and memory. Grated sweet potatoes mixed with molasses, brown sugar, and nutmeg made the air thick with warmth. It was baked slowly until the edges browned and the center held together just enough to slice. Families called it pudding, but it felt more like a hymn, soft, golden, and deeply Southern. At Christmas, it appeared on every table from Virginia to Mississippi, often baked in cast iron pans slick with butter. It was sweet, but not fancy, rich, but never proud. A good pone carried the scent of wood smoke and spice, the rhythm of old hands stirring batter without a written recipe. The molasses gave it depth, the sweet potatoes gave it soul, and together they made something entirely their own. Some topped it with cream, others with nothing at all, because its sweetness spoke for itself. Long after the pans cooled, you could still smell it on the air, thick as nostalgia. Forgotten now in most kitchens, it once stood as proof that even the simplest roots could rise into something glorious. Molasses pull candy turned every kitchen into a place of laughter and patience. Made from dark molasses boiled with sugar and butter, it bubbled and hissed like a small storm before turning glossy and thick. Children waited for the moment when it was cool enough to touch but warm enough to stretch. Their hands, dusted in butter, pulled and twisted the sticky ropes under the soft glow of the stove. The candy turned from deep brown to golden as air slipped in, a transformation that felt like magic. It was wrapped in wax paper and tucked into tins for Christmas, gifts made from nothing but time and sweetness. Every piece carried fingerprints, laughter, and the echo of family gathered close. Some burned their fingers, some dropped pieces on the floor, but no one cared. The ritual mattered more than the result. When the jar was full, it meant the holidays had truly begun. These days, candy comes in bags and ribbons come pre-tied. But back then, joy was handmade, and it tasted like molasses and love. Hog's head cheese was the dish that came when the work was hardest and the reward most honest. Made after the winter hog killing, it used every bit of the animal, from cheek to snout, boiled down until the broth turned rich and gelatinous. Families seasoned it with pepper, vinegar, and cloves before pressing it into pans to set. When sliced cold, it shimmered like glass, savory and proud of its thrift. For Black families across the South, it wasn't a delicacy. It was a necessity turned tradition. Each bite told the story of resilience, of making do and making it good. The scent filled smokehouses and kitchens where nothing ever went to waste. It was served on crackers or cornbread, sometimes with mustard, sometimes plain. Children might have turned up their noses, but grown folks knew its worth. It was labor turned nourishment, history preserved in jelly and spice. Today, it's all but vanished, but it once stood as a reminder that from the humblest scraps came feasts fit for kings. Baked ham with clove and pineapple rings glittered like celebration itself. It was the proud centerpiece of countless 1970s Christmas tables, shimmering under layers of brown sugar glaze. The ham was studded with whole cloves and crowned with golden rings of pineapple fastened by cherries in the center. Every glaze sizzled under the oven's heat, caramelizing into a sweet, smoky crust that filled the air with comfort. Families sliced it thin for sandwiches the next day or thick for dinner beside greens and macaroni. It wasn't just food. It was performance, love, and pride baked into one dish. Mothers polished Pyrex trays and fathers carved with ceremony, serving slices that glistened like amber. The sweet fruit and salty meat made every bite feel both familiar and fancy. Though store-bought spiral hams have taken its place, none can replace the memory of that golden roast shining in the candlelight. It was more than a meal. It was a symbol of making the most of what you had and turning it into joy. Ambrosia salad was a bowl of color that felt like sunshine in the middle of winter. Layers of citrus, coconut, Cherries and whipped topping gleamed beneath the lights of holiday tables. It was sweet and cool, the kind of dessert that didn't need baking, just love and a good glass bowl. Each spoonful burst with tang and cream, a little taste of summer in December. For Black families across the South, it represented abundance, proof that celebration could bloom even when times were lean. Children reached for the cherries first, while elders smiled, remembering who first brought the recipe. No two ambrosias were ever the same. Some added pineapple, others marshmallows, but all carried the same joy. It sat proudly beside hams and pies, bright and cheerful like a promise. Today it's rarely seen, but back then, it was as common as laughter. Ambrosia salad was the sweet pause between stories, the dish that reminded everyone that beauty didn't come from money, it came from care. Cornbread dressing with giblets was the heart of Southern Christmas. Rich, smoky, and deeply seasoned, it carried the flavor of patience and memory. Cornbread crumbled into broth made from giblets, onions, celery, and sage until the texture turned soft and soulful. The oven transformed it into something golden on top and tender beneath. It wasn't fancy stuffing. It was Sunday dinner turned sacred. Every family had their own way, some adding boiled eggs, others sausage or oysters. The taste lingered long after the meal, heavy with spice and comfort. It was more than a side dish. It was a connection to generations who stirred the same bowl. The smell alone, earthy, herbed, and warm, meant Christmas was near. It filled the kitchen with stories told between bites, laughter cutting through the steam. You could taste every hour of care in each serving, every prayer whispered into the pan. Cornbread dressing with giblets wasn't just food, it was belonging on a plate. Oyster stew for Christmas Eve was a quiet kind of celebration. Along the coastal South, from the Carolinas to Maryland, families gathered around pots of cream, butter, and oysters simmering slow. The broth shimmered pale gold, rich but never heavy, tasting faintly of salt and smoke. It was eaten in silence or soft conversation, spoons clinking gently against porcelain bowls. For many African American families, it marked the calm before the joy, a pause to remember and give thanks. The oysters, often freshly caught, carried the sea's whisper into the house. Served with crackers or cornbread, it was simple yet elegant, humble but holy. There was no decoration needed, no grand dessert after, just warmth, flavor, and peace. Over time, the dish faded as seafood grew expensive and recipes shifted, but its memory still lingers on coastal winds. Oyster stew was proof that Christmas could be quiet and still feel full. Red velvet cake with cooked frosting was a labor of love before boxed mixes made it easy. Back then, the red came not from dye but from beets, earthy and rich, giving the cake its signature hue. The batter was velvety, the texture soft enough to melt between bites. The frosting, cooked on the stove, turned creamy and smooth with a custard base that cooled like silk. It was a showpiece at Christmas, carried proudly to church socials or laid at the center of the table. Families baked it days ahead, wrapping layers in wax paper so the flavor deepened with time. Every slice glowed crimson against white icing, a vision of pride and patience. The first bite always drew a smile, sweet but subtle, like the memory of a song half remembered. Few make it that way now, but those who do know it's not just cake. It's history in sugar and flour, a recipe that carried both love and legacy. Candied yams with burnt sugar crust could make a whole house stop talking. Thick slices of yam bathed in butter and brown sugar until the edges bubbled and caramelized into dark glass. The smell alone was enough to draw everyone to the kitchen door. It was a dish that glowed like amber, glistening beneath oven light. Each bite balanced soft sweetness with smoky depth, melting into the tongue like memory. Families made it with precision, layering yams just right so the syrup reached every corner. Some added nutmeg or orange zest, others just let the sugar speak. It was often the first dish to disappear, scraped clean before dessert was served. No holiday table felt right without it. Candied yams weren't just sweet, they were sacred, connecting generations through the simplest acts of care. When the crust cracked beneath a spoon, it was music, the sound of warmth returning home. Peach cobbler with biscuit crust was the kind of dessert that announced itself before you ever saw it. The smell of bubbling peaches thickened with sugar, and butter floated through the air, wrapping around you like a hug after church. Mamas would drop spoonfuls of biscuit dough across the top, never too perfect, always just right. In the oven, it browned into golden peaks that cracked open to reveal syrup thick as honey. Served hot from the skillet, it hissed when the first spoon cut through, juices pooling under the crust. Vanilla ice cream on top was optional, but nobody ever said no. This was the dessert that could turn silence into praise and leftovers into legend. You could taste the sunshine in every bite, sweet from the fruit, warm from the oven, and rich from the hand that stirred it. Peach cobbler carried the spirit of summer even in winter, reminding everyone that joy was meant to be shared. It was messy, sticky, and absolutely perfect, proof that flavor came from feeling, not fancy tools. The last bite always tasted like gratitude, the kind that lingers long after the bowl's been scraped clean. One spoonful, and the whole world slowed down. Smothered pork chops in onion gravy were a winter promise kept. Thick-cut chops seared golden, then simmered low in a bath of onions and broth until the meat turned tender and the sauce turned rich. The smell drifted through shotgun houses and small kitchens, wrapping everyone in comfort. Served with rice, greens, or cornbread, it made a meal fit for both Sunday dinner and Christmas night. The onions melted into sweetness, the gravy thickened into silk, and every bite carried the taste of patience. It was the food of working hands, made with care when the world outside felt cold and uncertain. Families crowded around chipped plates, pouring gravy over everything until it ran to the edges. No one left hungry, and no one left ungrateful. Smothered pork chops weren't fancy. They didn't need to be. They were proof that love could simmer in a pot and feed a soul better than gold ever could. Pineapple upside-down cake was pure Sunday sunshine baked in a skillet. Mama would melt butter and brown sugar first, letting it bubble just enough to coat the bottom before laying perfect golden rings of pineapple in place. A bright red cherry sat in the center of each ring, like jewels in a crown. The batter poured on top was thick and sweet, sealing the fruit in a sugary glaze that caramelized as it baked. When it flipped out of the pan, everyone held their breath until it landed, glistening, golden, and smelling like heaven. The cake was soft and airy, the fruit sticky and rich, a dance of sweet and tart that no one could resist. Served warm with a dollop of cream, it was the definition of show-stopping simplicity. You could taste the pride in every bite, proof that beauty could rise out of everyday things. Pineapple upside-down cake was more than dessert. It was an event. Families made it to celebrate, to impress, or simply to make Sunday feel extra sweet. The first slice always drew applause, the last one quiet sighs. It was the kind of dessert that made an ordinary meal feel like a moment worth remembering. Jellied cranberry mold was as much decoration as it was food, shimmering red under holiday lights like stained glass on a plate. It stood proudly at the center of Christmas tables, a perfect ring of tart and sweet made from canned cranberry, gelatin, and orange zest. It jiggled with grace when sliced, holding its shape as if too proud to collapse. Housewives in the mid-century treated it like art, pouring it into copper molds shaped like wreaths and stars. Each glossy slice offered relief from the heaviness of roasts and gravies, its sharp flavor cutting through the richness. Children loved watching it wobble. Adults loved how it dressed up the table, and everyone knew someone who swore theirs was the prettiest. It was the definition of presentation pride, a dish meant to impress, even if it was born from a can. A good mold wasn't just about taste, it was about timing, patience, and steady hands. Today, it's mostly a memory, its molds collecting dust in attics. But once, no Christmas table was complete without its ruby gleam and perfect shape, the sparkle of a simpler time when beauty could be poured, chilled, and shared with love. Coconut layer cake was the grand finale of any Sunday spread. tall and proud with frosting as white as a new tablecloth. Mama cracked coconuts by hand, saving every drop of milk and shaving the meat fine with patience born of love. The layers were soft and buttery, each one stacked carefully, then covered in billows of sweet icing that clung like snow. Every forkful carried a tender sweetness, rich but never heavy, with the faint crunch of fresh coconut catching the light. It was a cake made for special days, Easter, homecomings, or when company came calling. You could taste the care in every bite, the kind that took all afternoon but felt worth every minute. Children waited by the counter for stray flakes to fall, while grown folks admired the cake like art before slicing. It was the kind of dessert that silenced a table, not out of manners but awe. Coconut layer cake was not just food, it was ceremony, celebration, and memory covered in white. Even days later, the leftovers stayed moist, the frosting soft and forgiving. A slice of it could turn any Sunday into something sacred, proof that beauty could come from nothing more than butter, sugar, and heart. Hoppin John with rice and peas was more than a meal. It was a message carried across generations. Cooked around Christmas and New Year's, it symbolized luck, wealth, and the hope for better days. Black-eyed peas, stewed with rice, onions, and smoked meat, made the house smell like comfort and heritage. Each spoonful connected African roots to southern soil, where enslaved cooks transformed survival food into something sacred. Collard greens might share the plate, cornbread might sit beside it, but Hoppin John held the story. The peas represented coins, the rice meant abundance, and the pork carried strength for the year ahead. Families gathered over steaming bowls, stirring quietly before offering thanks. Some added peppers for heat, others a splash of vinegar for brightness, but all cooked it slow and deliberate, as tradition demanded. Leftovers became skippin' Jenny, reminding everyone to be humble and thrifty. Over time, its ritual faded from many homes, but the meaning still lingers in kitchens that remember. It was more than sustenance. It was belief made edible, a dish that carried faith in every grain of rice and every simmering hour. Pecan pralines were little miracles of sugar and patience. Mama would stand by the stove with a wooden spoon, stirring cream, sugar, and butter until the mixture thickened and pulled away from the pot. Timing was everything. 1 second too soon and they stayed soft, 1 second too late and they turned to rocks. When the mixture hit just right, she spooned it onto wax paper, the pecans glistening under their sugary coats. The air filled with the smell of toasted nuts and caramelized sweetness. Children hovered nearby, waiting for the candy to cool enough to steal. Each praline was crisp on the outside, creamy inside, sweet with a hint of salt. They were made for Christmas, for Sunday after church, or for no reason at all. They were rewards for good manners, tokens of love, and bites of home. Pecan pralines melted slow on the tongue, leaving behind warmth and wonder. Every batch was a gamble and a triumph, a test of instinct and care. The process was hard, but the joy was easy. In one small piece of candy lived every sweet thing about home, wrapped in sugar and memory. Collard greens with smoked neck bones were the kind of dish that turned time into flavor. They simmered all morning long, filling homes with a deep, steady scent that wrapped itself around every memory. The greens wilted slow, darkening as they soaked up smoke and salt from the bones. It wasn't a quick recipe. It was an act of devotion. The pot lid rattled, the broth thickened, and the kitchen grew warm even when the wind outside bit sharp. In many homes, the first taste wasn't eaten. It was offered in quiet thanks. The broth, called Potlikker, was sacred, sopped up with cornbread until not a drop remained. Families added hot sauce, pepper flakes, or a pinch of sugar, but the soul stayed the same. The greens spoke of survival and gratitude, of making beauty from what the world discarded. Every spoonful carried stories older than the table it sat on. Forgotten by fast meals and new diets, it remains one of the truest expressions of home. When the pot boiled low and the air grew heavy with comfort, you knew Christmas had finally arrived. Coconut custard pie was the taste of coastal celebration, sweet and fragrant with the scent of the sea. Made from grated coconut, fresh or canned, mixed into eggs, milk, and sugar, it baked into a custard so rich it glistened under its toasted top. Every bite was creamy and lush, carrying hints of vanilla and salt air. For many Black families in the Carolinas and along the Gulf, it was the taste of homecomings, of fish fries and Sunday gatherings where laughter filled the air. Coconut custard pie was both indulgence and memory, the kind of dessert that made ordinary days feel like occasions. It traveled well, sat beautifully on a table, and lasted just long enough for everyone to get a slice. It was proof that joy could be baked and comfort could be shared. Coconut custard pie was hospitality in its purest form, generous, golden, and filled with warmth that never truly fades. Sweet potato pie with brown sugar meringue crowned holiday tables with a beauty that matched its flavor. Smooth, mashed sweet potatoes blended with warm spices created a filling as rich as any custard, poured into a flaky handmade crust. The crowning touch was a cloud of meringue whipped with brown sugar until caramel-scented peaks formed and browned lightly in the oven. Families saved the first slice for honored guests or elders, a sign of respect and affection. The pie carried the sweetness of the southern soil and the skill of generations who knew how to stretch simple ingredients into celebration. Children licked the mixing bowls clean while parents watched the meringue rise, a shared moment of anticipation before the feast. Over time, commercial pies and instant mixes dulled the tradition, but those who remember the warm aroma of brown sugar meringue know that this dessert is more than food. It is a memory of family love, patient hands, and the quiet pride of homemade beauty. Vinegar pie was the surprise dessert that always made people raise an eyebrow until they tasted it. It was born from empty cupboards when lemons were gone and life demanded invention. Mama whisked sugar, butter, eggs, and just a spoonful of vinegar into a smooth custard that baked to golden perfection. The vinegar gave it a tart brightness, balancing the sweetness without giving away its secret. The first bite was pure wonder, silky, tangy, and light as air. It became a favorite not for its ingredients, but for its heart. Vinegar pie reminded families that even hard times could taste good with enough care and courage. It was a lesson in resilience disguised as dessert, elegant in its simplicity and proud in its honesty. The smell, faintly buttery and sweet, lingered long after supper ended. It was the flavor of making do and somehow making magic too. Rum fruit punch was a celebration poured into crystal bowls, bright with color and bold with heat. It was sweet, tropical, and strong enough to make even quiet uncles laugh. Made from pineapple juice, orange slices, and dark rum, it shimmered beneath floating ice rings shaped like wreaths. The punch bowl sat at the center of the room, surrounded by laughter, jazz records, and the hum of conversation. Aunties ladled it out with practiced hands, warning the young ones to stick to ginger ale. It was joy you could sip, warmth that crept up slow and soft. The flavor balanced sweetness with spice, like sunshine bottled for winter. Every glass carried history, West Indian roots mingled with Southern tradition, a fusion of migration and memory. The last sip was always the best, where fruit had soaked and softened, tasting of everything and nothing all at once. It wasn't just a drink, it was community in liquid form. Long before store-bought mixes and coolers, rum fruit punch stood for gathering, laughter, and the quiet ache of missing those gone before. Banana pudding with vanilla wafers was the crown jewel of Sunday desserts, cold and creamy with layers that meant patience. Mama would line the pan with golden wafers, spoon-thick vanilla custard over them, and tuck in sliced bananas so ripe they almost melted on sight. Then came another layer, and another, each one smoother than the last. It sat overnight in the fridge, firming just enough so that when the spoon hit, it gave a soft sigh of surrender. Some topped it with meringue, others with whipped cream, but everyone agreed it was best served chilled and quiet with laughter somewhere nearby. Kids fought for the corner pieces where the wafers had gone soft and sweet, and elders got the first scoop for respect's sake. It was a dessert that spoke of care, measured, layered, and perfectly timed. No one rushed banana pudding. It was love that needed to set. Every family gathering ended the same way, with someone scraping the bowl for the last taste. It was simple food made sacred by routine, a Southern blessing turned ritual. Even now, one spoonful takes you right back to that crowded kitchen, full of stories, heat, and the sound of joy humming low like gospel. Buttermilk pound cake was the smell that pulled every child from the yard and every grown man from his nap. Dense, buttery, and baked golden in a bundt pan, it was the dessert that never needed frosting to impress. Mama would pour the batter thick and smooth, humming to herself as she scraped the bowl clean. The scent filled the whole house long before the timer rang, and by the time it came out, the crust had turned just crisp enough to flake under your fingers. The inside stayed moist, soft, and rich, melting on the tongue like memory itself. It was sliced thin for company, thick for family, and never served without a smile. No matter the occasion, Sunday supper, a homecoming, or a neighbor's visit, there was always room for pound cake. The sweetness was steady, never loud, and that was what made it special. It was love baked slow and simple, using what the pantry offered and nothing more. You did not need icing when your heart was already full. Every crumb tasted like care, and the smell lingered long after the plates were washed. Buttermilk pound cake was more than dessert. It was the promise that home was always warm. Chitterlings and eggs were for Sunday mornings when the whole house smelled like patience and pride. The chitterlings were cleaned carefully, washed again and again, then seasoned deep with salt, pepper, and onions before hitting the skillet. They fried slowly, releasing a scent that told everyone it was a day worth slowing down for. The eggs came next, scrambled in the same pan so they could soak up every drop of flavor left behind. Together they made a breakfast rich enough to feel like a celebration, not just a meal. It was a dish born from necessity, but carried with joy, a way to turn what others overlooked into something worth gathering for. The taste was bold, earthy, and unforgettable, layered with memory and meaning. Coffee brewed in the corner, laughter circled the table, and music sometimes played from a radio humming low. Chitterlings and eggs were not for every morning. They were for the ones that mattered most. They tasted of care, community, and the comfort of surviving one more week together. Each plate told a story that stretched back generations, of families who knew how to make beauty from struggle and celebration from scraps. Baked chicken drumsticks with barbecue sauce were a Sunday treat even if it was Tuesday. Cheap family packs meant you could feed everyone without breaking your wallet. You would season the chicken with salt, pepper, and maybe a little sugar if you wanted that glaze to stick. Then it went into the oven until the smell wrapped around the house. The sauce would bubble and darken, thick like molasses, dripping down to the pan. Every piece came out sticky, sweet, and smoky, just right. You could eat it with white bread or plain rice, and it felt like more than enough. No one cared that it was not fancy. It was full of flavor and made with love. You licked your fingers clean and went back for seconds even when you said you were full. That was what made it special. It was proof that food did not need a big budget to feel like a celebration. Just heat, sauce, and time. Lemon icebox pie was the cool sigh after a long Sunday meal, the kind of dessert that refreshed and revived all at once. It came together without fuss, just condensed milk, eggs, lemon juice, and a graham cracker crust pressed by hand. Mama mixed it smooth, poured it in, and let the fridge do the rest. No oven, no rush, just patience and chill. The pie set firm overnight, so by the next afternoon it sliced clean and gleamed like sunshine on a plate. Tart enough to wake you up, sweet enough to keep you coming back, it was balance made edible. The first bite hit sharp, then melted soft and silky. Folks would sneak spoonfuls before dinner, claiming to just test it, but everyone knew better. Lemon icebox pie was a reward for making it through another week, a sweet pause between the noise of living and the peace of resting. Its flavor stayed long after the last crumb was gone. That bright citrus tang reminded everyone that joy could be simple: a pie, a quiet moment, and someone to share it with. Cool, creamy, and endlessly comforting, it was the taste of Sunday's peace in every slice. Brown sugar glazed carrots brought color and comfort to the Christmas table. Sliced thick and simmered in butter, brown sugar, and a hint of cinnamon, they gleamed under the light like little jewels. The glaze clung to each piece, sweet and sticky, caramelizing just enough to make them irresistible. They balanced the heaviness of meats and casseroles, adding brightness where it was needed most. Children who claimed to hate vegetables always asked for seconds. The smell of sugar and spice filled the kitchen as mothers stirred carefully, knowing when to stop before the syrup thickened too much. It was a side dish made from simplicity and love, the kind of food that reminded everyone that even small things could shine. Though overlooked now, it once stood proudly beside the stars of the meal, humble but unforgettable. When the last spoonful disappeared, the pan left behind a glaze so good someone always scraped it clean. Brown sugar-glazed carrots proved that sweetness and care could make even the simplest food a memory worth keeping. Stewed okra and tomatoes were the kind of dish that took simple garden produce and turned it into something nourishing enough to feed a family. Okra, a vegetable with African origins, thrived in southern soil, while tomatoes grew easily in backyard gardens. Together, simmered slowly with onions, spices, and sometimes a scrap of salt pork, they created a stew that was tangy, savory, and thick. Families relied on it because it stretched small harvests into larger meals, often served over rice or with cornbread to make it filling. The dish was especially important when meat was too expensive to buy, as it added depth and nutrition without needing animal protein. Stewed okra and tomatoes became more than food. They were a way to survive with what the land provided. For many, the taste carried reminders of summer gardens and the hard work it took to keep families fed. It was frugal, delicious, and a perfect example of survival cooking. Wild grape connected plantation kitchens to the native abundance of the American South. Muscadine and scuppernong grapes grew untended along fences and forest edges, providing a dependable late summer harvest. Enslaved workers gathered the clusters and crushed them by hand to create a tangy juice that could be fermented slightly for a refreshing drink or boiled into a syrupy must used to season grains and greens. This technique echoed West African traditions of using fruit reductions to brighten savory dishes. After emancipation, muscadine wine and homemade grape jellies became hallmarks of Southern foodways, and small farms still produce them today. The careful gathering and slow simmering required patience and skill, qualities that defined the cooking of those who made the most of every wild resource. Wild grape stands as both a practical recipe and a testament to how African American cooks merged Old World techniques with New World ingredients, leaving a flavor that continues to shape regional preserves and beverages across the Carolinas and Georgia. Cowpea and collard stew combined two powerhouse ingredients that sustained countless families through hard times. Field peas, also known as cowpeas, were simmered slowly with smoky meat and joined by hearty collard greens, creating a dish rich in protein, vitamins, and earthy flavor. The long cooking process filled homes with an aroma that signaled comfort and nourishment. Farmers valued cowpeas for their ability to thrive in poor soil, while collards offered leaves long after other vegetables had withered. Together, they made a meal that cost little but fed many, reflecting a tradition of resourcefulness and care. Mothers and grandmothers seasoned the pot with onions, garlic, and pepper, each adding a personal touch passed down through generations. Families gathered around the table with slices of cornbread to soak up the flavorful broth, finding strength in every spoonful. Though supermarkets now offer endless choices, the slow-simmered union of cowpeas and collards stands as a reminder of a time when simple ingredients created enduring nourishment. Sorghum syrup biscuits with milk were the kind of dinner that showed how families found sweetness even in struggle. Sorghum syrup, cheaper than sugar, was kept in jars that seemed to last forever, poured generously over hot biscuits fresh from the oven. My grandmother baked the biscuits with flour and lard, ingredients that could be stretched and shared across multiple meals. Once the biscuits were ready, she split them open, drizzled them with syrup, and served them with cold milk poured into glasses. It was simple but filling, providing enough energy for tired workers and growing children. The sweetness of the syrup turned plain flour biscuits into something that felt like a treat, even if it was just supper. In the 1960s, this kind of meal reminded families that comfort did not always need meat or elaborate dishes. It was about making do with what was on hand and finding joy in it. Sorghum syrup biscuits with milk were a reminder that sweetness could soften the edge of hardship. Homemade chow-chow relish added brightness and crunch to plates crowded with greens, beans, and smoked meats. Cabbage, onions, peppers, and green tomatoes were chopped fine and simmered with vinegar, mustard seed, and sugar until they formed a tangy condiment that could last through winter. Every household had a slightly different recipe, some sweeter, some hotter, each a reflection of the cook's own hand. The relish brought sharp contrast to rich dishes like pork shoulder or pinto beans, cutting through heaviness with a lively bite. In late summer, neighbors gathered to chop vegetables together, sharing stories as big pots bubbled on outdoor fires. Jars lined pantry shelves in rows of glowing gold and green, a promise of flavor when fresh produce was long gone. Over time, store-bought pickles and bottled sauces replaced the careful preparation of chow-chow, but its memory endures wherever families recall the sound of knives on wooden boards and the reward of a bright spoonful alongside a hearty meal. Bay leaf infusion offered warmth and gentle comfort, using one of the few aromatic plants that grew wild near plantation quarters. Fresh or dried bay leaves were gathered from native bay trees and steeped in hot water to create a soothing tea with a light floral scent and mild medicinal qualities. This infusion was believed to aid digestion and ease colds, and it provided a calming moment during hard days. The knowledge of bay's healing properties came from both African herbal traditions and local indigenous practices, merging into a shared understanding of the land's quiet gifts. Even after emancipation, African American communities continued to brew bay tea for health and hospitality, and its subtle fragrance remains a hallmark of Southern kitchens where bay leaves still flavor soups and stews. Bay leaf infusion stands as a gentle reminder that survival was not only about calories but also about care, showing how enslaved people drew strength and solace from the natural world around them. Pig ear sandwiches were another example of how Black families wasted nothing and found flavor where others saw scraps. Pig ears, which butchers often sold cheaply, were boiled until tender, then sliced thin and placed between bread with mustard or hot sauce. The texture was chewy, but the taste was rich and savory, making them surprisingly satisfying. For many, these sandwiches became a dependable lunch or supper when more expensive meats were out of reach. They were especially common in rural towns where hogs were butchered at home and every part of the animal was used. Families knew that wasting nothing was not just thrifty, it was survival. Eating pig ears was also a mark of resilience, turning overlooked cuts into a food that people grew to enjoy. Today, pig ear sandwiches are remembered as a dish born from necessity, but filled with pride, showing just how much strength could be found in the humblest of meals. Burdock root stew speaks to the deep botanical knowledge carried by African cooks who could read the land for nourishment even when fields were bare. Burdock, a hardy root with a flavor similar to earthy artichoke, grew wild along fence rows and shaded ditches where other crops refused to thrive. Gatherers dug the long taproots with simple hand tools, scrubbed them clean, and sliced them thin before simmering them for hours with any garden greens or herbs that might be on hand. The slow cooking softened the root into a tender base for a broth that was both filling and rich in minerals. This practice echoed African and indigenous traditions of using wild roots as a staple during lean times. After emancipation, burdock continued to appear in rural foraging guides and folk remedies, admired for its subtle sweetness and sustaining qualities. Today, herbalists still value burdock for its nutrients, reminding us that what once served as a quiet survival food remains a symbol of resourcefulness, and a connection to the untamed landscape of the American South. Hoghead cheese was a triumph of resourcefulness, transforming every part of the animal into a dish of surprising elegance. After a hog was butchered, the head was simmered slowly with onions, herbs, and spices until the meat fell from the bone. The rich broth was strained and cooled, setting into a savory jelly that held tender shreds of meat and subtle seasoning. Sliced and served cold with crackers or bread, it became a delicacy at gatherings where nothing was wasted and flavor was celebrated. Making it required patience and skill, with families sharing techniques that varied from one household to the next. Children watched the slow process with a mix of curiosity and awe, learning that thrift could create unexpected pleasures. Today, few people undertake the labor of hoghead cheese, and store-bought versions lack the character of the homemade original, but its history endures as a testament to resilience and the deep respect African-American cooks held for every gift the animal provided. Butter beans and rice were another cheap but comforting meal that carried families through lean times. Butter beans, with their creamy texture, were slow-cooked until tender, often flavored with a smoked ham hock or bone if one was available. The smoky taste infused the beans and created a rich broth that poured beautifully over rice. My grandmother used long-grain rice that stretched a pot of beans into enough servings for the whole household. The dish was hearty, filling, and nourishing, feeding both body and spirit. Butter beans were inexpensive compared to meat, yet they carried enough protein to keep families going strong. Children learned to appreciate the soft beans and flavorful broth as part of everyday meals, and adults recognized their value in stretching budgets. It was not a dish of extravagance but of practicality, a dinner that turned cheap staples into something people looked forward to. Butter beans and rice told the story of resilience in kitchens where every penny counted and every plate needed to satisfy. Ground pumpkin seed. Porridge transformed leftover seeds into a hearty meal that supplied both protein and healthy oils. After pumpkins were cooked for pies or stews, the seeds were washed, dried, and pounded into a coarse meal. This meal was simmered slowly in water or thin milk, creating a creamy porridge with a subtle nutty flavor. Sweetened lightly with honey or molasses when available, it became a sustaining breakfast or evening dish that used every part of the harvest. The method reflected West African culinary traditions where ground seeds thickened soups and stews, showing how transplanted knowledge enriched American foodways. Generations after emancipation, pumpkin seed porridge remained a seasonal specialty in some rural areas, appreciated for its nourishing qualities and gentle taste. Modern cooks might recognize it in contemporary seed-based milks and cereals, proving that this centuries-old practice still influences how we eat today. Ground pumpkin seed. Porridge highlights the wisdom of never wasting what nature provides and celebrates a heritage of careful resourcefulness that continues to inspire. Hog maw stew was a dish that took something most would discard and transformed it into a centerpiece for the table. Hog maw, the lining of a pig's stomach, was cleaned carefully, then stuffed with potatoes, onions, and spices before being simmered until tender. The result was hearty, filling, and deeply flavorful, stretching small amounts of ingredients into a meal that could feed an entire family. In times when money was scarce, hog maw stew allowed families to make use of what they had, proving that nothing from the animal went to waste. It was often served at gatherings where one pot had to go far, reminding everyone of the value of sharing and stretching food. The dish carried cultural roots tied to both survival and celebration, a reminder that even hard times could produce food that comforted and united. Hog maw stew was not fancy, but it represented ingenuity, thrift, and strength in the face of want. Pokeweed greens offered one of the first fresh tastes of spring for people living with few supplies after a long winter. Young pokeweed shoots emerged early and plentifully, but they carried natural toxins that required careful boiling in several changes of water. Enslaved cooks, drawing on African knowledge of wild plants, mastered this technique to create a tender, spinach-like dish that supplied vital vitamins when gardens were only beginning to grow. Seasoned with a bit of salt pork or a sprinkle of wild herbs, poke greens became a welcome sign of the changing season. Long after emancipation, poke salad festivals in Appalachia and the Deep South celebrated this once humble plant, turning a survival ingredient into a community tradition. The careful preparation taught by generations of African American cooks is still followed today, preserving both safety and flavor. Pokeweed greens remind us that deep botanical knowledge and patient cooking transformed a potentially dangerous weed into nourishing food that helped sustain families through the hardest times. If these forgotten African American Christmas dishes warmed your heart, drop your favorite in the comments, like the video, and subscribe to keep the memories cooking.